He was trusted, respected, and welcomed into every home in town, until the night he vanished without a trace. What this American pastor left behind wasn't a sermon or a farewell. It was something so disturbing that the people who found it wished they hadn't. Where are you listening to this story from? Are you alone in your room, or perhaps gathered with loved ones? Either way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because stories like the tragic case of the vanished American pastor deserve to be remembered, shared, and never forgotten. For decades, the town of Hollow Creek believed they knew their pastor. He was a man of calm words and steady hands, someone people trusted with their fears, their sins, and their last prayers. His church stood at the edge of town, old and quiet, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations of believers who never imagined that something evil could hide behind such familiar walls. Then, one night, the pastor vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, no farewell, no explanation. His car was still parked behind the church, his coat folded neatly in his office, and the lights left on as if he planned to return at any moment. At first, the town told itself this was temporary, that he had simply gone away, overwhelmed, seeking solitude. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, a darker question began to take root. What did he leave behind? Locked away among forgotten church records and dust-covered boxes was something never meant to be found. A secret so macabre, so deeply disturbing, that those who uncovered it would later admit they wished the pastor had never disappeared at all. Because some absences are safer than the truths they conceal, and once this story begins, there is no turning back. In the small American town of Hollow Creek, trust was a currency more valuable than money. People locked their doors but left their hearts open, believing that evil belonged to distant cities, not to a place where everyone knew each other's names. At the center of that fragile sense of safety stood Pastor Elijah Moore, a man whose presence alone seemed to calm storms no one else could see. Elijah had arrived in Hollow Creek nearly 20 years earlier, during a winter so harsh that the river froze solid for the first time in decades. He was young then, barely past 40, with tired eyes and a voice that carried warmth, even when speaking of sin, death, and judgment. The church board welcomed him eagerly. The congregation followed without question. From the beginning, he was everything they wanted him to be. He baptized their children. He buried their parents. He listened in silence while confessions spilled from trembling mouths behind closed doors. In Hollow Creek, secrets were whispered to Pastor Moore long before they were ever spoken aloud to anyone else. His church sat at the edge of town, where the paved road turned to gravel and the trees grew too close together. Built in 1891, the building had once been white, but time and weather had dulled it into a tired gray. The bell tower leaned slightly, just enough to be noticeable if you stared too long. Locals joked that the church was slowly bowing its head in prayer. No one laughed when the wind made the bell ring on its own at night. Pastor Moore lived alone in the small parsonage behind the church. He never married, never had children. When asked, he smiled politely and said that God had called him to a life of service, not family. The explanation satisfied most people. In Hollow Creek, unanswered questions were often treated as impolite. Yet there were things about Elijah Moore that lingered just beneath the surface, details so subtle they felt wrong only in hindsight. He never allowed anyone into the church basement. When volunteers offered to clean or organize old records, he declined gently but firmly. When the boiler malfunctioned one winter, he insisted on fixing it himself, refusing help even from trained technicians in town. "Some parts of the past are better left undisturbed," he once said with a soft smile. The comment was dismissed as a theological metaphor. His sermons were powerful but strange. While other pastors spoke of forgiveness and redemption, Elijah often lingered on guilt, on the permanence of sin, on the idea that some actions once committed could never be undone, only buried. His words unsettled some congregants, but most found them honest. real. After all, life wasn't clean. Why should faith be? Children, however, avoided him, not because he was cruel, he was never cruel, but because his gaze lingered too long, as if he were listening to something they couldn't hear. Parents laughed it off, saying kids sensed seriousness the way animals sensed storms. No one ever accused him of wrongdoing. There was nothing concrete to accuse. And then, one autumn night, Pastor Elijah Moore vanished. It was a Wednesday, Bible study night. 5 people waited in the pews while the clock ticked past 7. At first, they assumed he was running late. By 7:30, concern crept in. By 8, the church was empty, except for unanswered questions. His car was still parked behind the building. The lights in his office were on. His Bible lay open on the desk, a thin ribbon marking a page in the book of Numbers. A half-finished cup of coffee had gone cold beside it. His coat hung neatly on the back of the chair. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken windows, no footprints in the damp soil behind the church. Pastor Moore had simply ceased to exist. The sheriff searched the surrounding woods. Volunteers combed the riverbanks. State police were called in. They questioned everyone. They found nothing, no body, no blood, no evidence of departure. Hollow Creek held its breath. At first, people whispered that he'd had a breakdown, that the weight of everyone's sins had finally crushed him. Some said he'd run away to start over. Others suggested something darker, an affair, a hidden life, a scandal waiting to explode. But days passed, then weeks, then months, and the church remained locked. The church board debated reopening with a temporary pastor, but something stopped them. No one could quite explain it. Some said it felt wrong. Others said they were waiting, as if Pastor Moore might walk back through the doors at any moment, coat in hand, apologizing for being late. No one noticed the smell at first. It was faint, old, like damp paper and earth. When it grew stronger, they blamed the building's age, mold, maybe, rot. The past had a way of decaying quietly. It wasn't until nearly a year after the disappearance that the decision was made to inventory the church records. Insurance demanded documentation. The town needed closure. The church basement, long forbidden, would finally be opened. The key was found in Pastor Moore's desk drawer. When the door to the basement was unlocked, the smell rushed out like a held breath finally released. Dust swirled in the beam of a flashlight, revealing shelves stacked with boxes, some labeled neatly, others left blank. The air was colder down there, unnaturally so, as if the earth itself resisted being disturbed. They found journals, dozens of them, leather-bound, identical, their spines worn smooth by use. Inside, Pastor Moore's handwriting filled every page, tight, precise, obsessive. Dates stretched back nearly 15 years. At first, the entries seemed harmless. Reflections on sermons, notes about parishioners, observations about guilt, repentance, and the human capacity for self-deception. Then, the tone shifted. The language grew darker, more personal, less theological. He wrote about secrets entrusted to him, not just confessed sins, but things people never meant to say aloud. He wrote about the weight of knowing too much, about how some truths could infect the soul of the listener, about how silence, when chosen correctly, could be an act of mercy. And then, buried deep within the journals, they found the final entry. It wasn't dated. The ink was darker, pressed harder into the page. "I have done what needed to be done," it read. "The ground remembers, even if the people do not. God will judge me, but this town will survive. Some horrors must remain hidden, even from the light." There were no more pages after that. No explanation, no confession, only the certainty that Pastor Elijah Moore hadn't disappeared by accident. He had vanished on purpose, and whatever he left behind was never meant to be found. The discovery of the journals shattered the quiet grief Hollow Creek had grown accustomed to. Until that moment, Pastor Elijah Moore's disappearance had been a wound sealed with uncertainty. Painful, yes, but manageable. Now, uncertainty had turned malignant. The journals were proof that something had been festering beneath the town for years, quietly, patiently, waiting to be uncovered. The sheriff ordered the basement sealed within hours. Sheriff Daniel Harper was a man shaped by routine and rules, someone who believed that chaos could always be organized if you followed procedure closely enough. He had grown up in Hollow Creek, attended the same church as everyone else, and shaken Pastor Moore's hand every Sunday without hesitation. Reading the final entry of the journal unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. "I have done what needed to be done." Those words refused to stay on the page. They echoed. The journals were taken to the sheriff's office and placed in an evidence locker that hadn't been used in years. Officially, they were part of a missing persons investigation. Unofficially, no one wanted to be alone with them. Harper assigned himself to read them. At first, the earlier entries felt invasive but harmless. Private thoughts never meant for other eyes. Pastor Moore wrote obsessively, sometimes filling multiple pages in a single night. He documented conversations with parishioners in unnerving detail, often recording not just what was said, but how it was said. Hesitations, changes in breathing, the moment someone avoided eye contact. He confesses with relief, one entry read, but relief is dangerous. It convinces people they are finished with their sins. Another, they believe forgiveness erases consequences. They are wrong. As Harper moved forward through the journals, the handwriting subtly changed. The neat precision grew tighter, more angular. The language lost warmth. Moore began referring to certain individuals not by name, but by letters. Subject A, Subject D, Subject H. Patterns emerged. The same letters appeared repeatedly across different years, always associated with words like burden, danger, contagion. Moore wrote about protecting the town, not spiritually, but physically. As if Hollow Creek itself were a body, and certain people were diseases. Harper felt a slow, creeping dread settle into his chest. Meanwhile, word spread. Despite the sheriff's efforts, rumors escaped the evidence room and slithered through the town like smoke. People whispered about confession journals and dark secrets. Some insisted the pastor had been blackmailing the town. Others believed he had uncovered something monstrous and paid the price for it. Attendance at the church, still closed, became irrelevant. Faith shifted from sermons to suspicion. Neighbors began watching one another. Old grudges resurfaced. Long-forgotten arguments suddenly felt significant again, as if any unresolved conflict might be tied to the journals hidden behind the sheriff's desk. In Hollow Creek, paranoia was contagious. The first name everyone searched for was missing. There was no mention of a teenage girl named Rebecca Collins. Rebecca had vanished 13 years earlier. At the time, she was 17, quiet, obedient, deeply involved in church activities. Her disappearance had devastated the town, but it had been ruled a runaway case within weeks. Pastor Moore had officiated the prayer service held in her honor. In the journals, however, Harper found multiple entries dated just weeks before Rebecca disappeared. Subject R is dangerous, Moore had written, not by choice, by nature. Some truths, once spoken, cannot be unheard. There was no explanation of what Rebecca had done, or known, only the implication that her absence had been intentional. Harper closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. He reminded himself that journals were not evidence, that pastors dealt with metaphor and symbolism, that religious language could exaggerate, dramatize, but the dates were precise. And Rebecca Collins had never been found. The second name that haunted Harper was his own, not directly, never written plainly, but there were entries describing a boy, Subject H, who had confessed to something unforgivable as a teenager, someone who had begged for guidance, not punishment, someone Pastor Moore had promised to handle. Harper remembered that boy, because he had been that boy. The memory clawed its way up from a place he had sealed shut decades ago. A hunting accident, a friend, a moment of panic. A lie that had grown roots. Pastor Moore had listened, had prayed, had told him that God demanded accountability, but the world did not always need to know, that some burdens were meant to be carried alone. "I will ensure no further harm comes from this," the journal read. "This town will not suffer because of his mistake." Harper's pulse pounded in his ears. He realized then that the journals weren't records of confession. They were records of judgment, and Pastor Elijah Moore had appointed himself executioner. The next discovery was physical. During a second, more thorough search of the church basement, authorized reluctantly by the sheriff himself, a deputy noticed inconsistencies in the floor, boards that didn't match, nails newer than the rest, subtle but unmistakable once you knew to look. Beneath the floorboards were shallow pits, empty now. The soil was darker there, heavier, as if it remembered something being taken from it. Forensic teams were called in quietly. No press, no announcements, just men in gloves and masks digging where faith once stood. They found traces, bone fragments, fabric fibers, degraded beyond recognition, enough to confirm the unthinkable, enough to ensure the truth could never stay buried again. As news leaked, because it always did, Hollow Creek began to fracture. Some refused to believe it. They defended Pastor Moore fiercely, insisting the evidence was planted, misinterpreted, fabricated by outsiders who didn't understand the town. Others retreated into silence, haunted by the possibility that their own confessions might have sealed someone else's fate. And then there were those who began to fear that Pastor Moore wasn't gone, that he was watching. Lights flickered in the church at night, despite the power being cut. Doors were found unlocked that had been secured hours earlier. Someone left a single journal page on the steps of the sheriff's office one morning, its ink fresh, despite the age of the paper. It contained only one sentence: "You were forgiven. Others were not." Harper felt the weight of the town's eyes on him every time he stepped outside. People trusted him, but not fully. How could they? Trust had become a liability. He stopped sleeping. When he did manage to rest, he dreamed of the basement, of soil pressing down on his chest, of whispers leaking through the cracks in the floorboards. He dreamed of Pastor Moore standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching him with calm, disappointed eyes. "You were spared," the pastor said in the dream. "Do not waste it." Harper woke each time with the same thought clawing at his mind. What if the pastor hadn't disappeared to escape judgment? What if he had left to avoid stopping? Because the journals ended abruptly, but the work they described felt unfinished. And somewhere beyond Hollow Creek, a man who believed he had done what needed to be done might still be walking free, watching, waiting. Hollow Creek had always believed silence was a form of peace. Now it learned, too late, that silence could also be a weapon. After the forensic teams finished their work beneath the church floor, the town changed in ways that no official report could capture. People stopped lingering after conversations. Doors closed faster. Smiles became cautious, rehearsed. Everyone wondered the same thing, but no one dared ask it aloud. What did the pastor know about me? The sheriff's office was flooded with requests. Some wanted access to the journals, desperate to confirm their names were not inside. Others begged Harper to burn them, insisting that reopening old sins would only cause more harm. A few demanded arrests, trials, justice, anything that could restore the illusion of order. Harper denied them all. The journals were locked away, catalogued, guarded. But their presence was felt everywhere, like a toxin in the water supply. Confessions that had once felt sacred now seemed transactional. Every act of kindness by Pastor Moore was reinterpreted as strategy. Every sermon replayed in memory, its words stripped of comfort and replaced with threat. The church was officially condemned. Yellow tape cordoned off the property, fluttering like warning flags in the wind. Some nights people claimed they saw movement inside, shadows passing across the stained glass windows, the bells swaying without sound. The sheriff dismissed these reports publicly, but privately he avoided driving past the building after dark. The dreams returned, not just for Harper, but for others. A woman named Clara Hensley reported waking every night at 3:17 a.m., the exact time her husband had died years earlier in what was ruled a workplace accident. She swore she could hear footsteps in her hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping outside her bedroom door. When she opened it, there was nothing there, except the faint smell of old paper and damp earth. Another man, Thomas Reed, began digging holes in his backyard without realizing it. He told his wife he was making room, though he couldn't explain for what. When deputies arrived for a wellness check, they found him standing in the pit, staring at his hands, crying. The town doctor called it collective trauma. Harper called it guilt, finding a voice. The journals revealed more than crimes. They revealed a pattern. Pastor Moore had not acted impulsively. His decisions were calculated, methodical. He selected people who, in his view, posed a threat to the town's moral stability. Not criminals in the legal sense, but liabilities. People who knew things they shouldn't. People who might speak. Harper read the entries again and again, searching for logic that would make it less monstrous. But the more he read, the clearer it became. Moore believed Hollow Creek was a fragile system. One secret exposed could unravel it entirely. So he removed the variables, and he justified it with faith. The most disturbing realization came when Harper noticed gaps. Entire years with no entries, periods when people had disappeared or died under strange circumstances, yet Moore's journals were silent. Not because nothing happened, but because those actions were, in Moore's mind, resolved, finished. No longer worth documenting. That terrified Harper more than the written confessions. It suggested there were crimes so complete they didn't require reflection. The state police took over the investigation officially, but their presence only deepened the divide. Outsiders asked questions locals refused to answer. Old friendships cracked under pressure. Some residents moved away quietly, leaving houses empty, mail piling up like abandoned identities. Others stayed and watched. One evening, Harper received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm, male, familiar in a way that made his stomach tighten. "You've read enough to know the truth," the voice said. "Stop digging." Harper demanded a name. The line went dead. The call was traced to a payphone 3 towns over. The camera footage showed a man in a hooded jacket, his face obscured, but his posture, upright, deliberate, was unmistakable. Harper knew then what he had been avoiding since the journals were found. Pastor Elijah Moore was alive, and he was still deciding what needed to be done. The following week, another journal page appeared. This time it was left inside Harper's patrol car. No forced entry, no fingerprints, just a single page folded neatly on the driver's seat. "You confuse justice with exposure," it read. "They are not the same." That night, Harper finally opened the file he had sworn never to touch. His own confession. The hunting accident had not been an accident, a fight, a push, a moment of rage he had buried beneath years of service, badges, and good deeds. Pastor Moore had known, had carried that truth like a loaded weapon, and chosen, for reasons Harper never fully understood, to lock it away instead of using it. Harper realized the awful truth. He had been spared not because he was innocent, but because he was useful. The pastor had been building a town of controlled silence, of carefully selected survivors, and Harper, with his authority and loyalty, had been part of that design. The next disappearance shattered any remaining doubt. Clara Hensley vanished on a Sunday morning. Her car was found parked behind the condemned church. The trunk was empty. In the dirt near the basement entrance, investigators found a fresh disturbance, soil recently turned, as if someone had knelt there. This time, the state police couldn't contain it. News vans arrived. Headlines spread. Hollow Creek became a name whispered with unease across the country. A town with too many secrets, a pastor who played God, graves without bodies. Harper stood at the edge of the church property as cameras rolled, feeling the weight of a choice he could no longer avoid. If he told everything, the town would collapse, lives would be destroyed. The truth would consume not just the guilty, but the innocent who had built their identities on silence. If he stayed quiet, the disappearances would continue. Pastor Moore had made his choice years ago. Now it was Harper's turn. That night, Harper returned to the basement alone. The air was colder than he remembered. The pits gaped like open mouths, waiting. He knelt beside one and pressed his hand into the soil. It was damp, heavy, remembering. "I won't be part of this anymore," he whispered, unsure who he was speaking to. God, the dead, or the man who had vanished. From the shadows, a voice answered softly, "It's too late for that." Harper froze. Pastor Elijah Moore stepped into the dim light, older, thinner, but unmistakably real. His eyes were calm, regretful, certain. "The town still stands," Moore said. "Because I did what no one else would." Harper stood, his heart hammering. "And how many more?" he demanded. "How many more before you're satisfied?" Moore smiled faintly. "That depends," he said, "on what you choose to do next." Shepherd Elijah Moore had always spoken softly, as if raising his voice might fracture something fragile in the air. Standing now in the basement of the condemned church, surrounded by disturbed earth and the ghosts of decisions long buried, he spoke the same way. Calm, measured, almost gentle. It made the situation infinitely worse. Sheriff Daniel Harper did not reach for his gun. Some instinct older than fear told him it would be useless. This was not a standoff between lawman and criminal. It was a confrontation between two men bound by the same secret, even if they stood on opposite sides of it. "You shouldn't be here," Harper said, his voice hoarse. "The entire state is looking for you." Moore nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a minor inconvenience. "They're looking for a monster," he replied. "I was careful never to become one in their eyes." Harper laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "You buried people under this church." "I protected this town," Moore corrected. "There is a difference." The basement felt smaller with him in it. The low ceiling pressed down, amplifying every breath, every shift of weight. Harper realized that Moore had likely stood in this very spot many times before, deciding fates with the same calm expression he now wore. "You don't get to decide who deserves to disappear," Harper said. "That's not justice." Moore tilted his head. "Justice is a human invention. Order is not." He stepped closer, careful not to cross the invisible boundary Harper had drawn around himself. Up close, the years had left their mark on the shepherd. Deep lines around his eyes, gray, threaded through his hair. But his gaze was unwavering. "I listened to them," Moore continued, "to what they confessed, to what they almost confessed. You would be amazed how many people carry horrors just beneath the surface, Sheriff. How many are one mistake away from destroying everything around them. And you decided to stop them," Harper said, "by killing them." Moore's lips pressed together briefly. "By silencing them." The distinction turned Harper's stomach. Above them, the church creaked in the wind. The sound reminded Harper of a living thing shifting in its sleep, unaware of the rot beneath its floorboards. "You're wrong," Harper said. "You didn't save this town, you poisoned it." Moore's eyes softened, not with pity, but with disappointment. "You think the poison is what I did?" "No, the poison is what would have happened if I hadn't." He reached into his coat pocket slowly. Harper tensed, but Moore only pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "A name," Moore said quietly. "One more." Harper shook his head. "No, you haven't even seen it." "I don't care who it is," Harper snapped. "It ends tonight." Moore studied him for a long moment. "That's what I thought you'd say. That's why I spared you all those years ago." The words landed like a blow. "You spared me," Harper said, his voice low. "You used me. Moore did not deny it. I needed someone who understood consequences, someone who could carry guilt without breaking. You were ideal. The truth settled heavily between them. Harper realized that every promotion, every success, every chance he'd had to make things right had been shaped by a man standing in front of him now. His entire life felt suddenly conditional. "What happens now?" Harper asked. Moore unfolded the paper and placed it gently on a nearby crate. "Now you choose whether Hollow Creek survives." The name stared back at Harper. Clara Hensley. Harper's breath caught. "She's already gone." Moore nodded. "Yes, but what she knew is not." Harper closed his eyes. He thought of Clara's sleepless nights, her whispers about footsteps, her terror. He had dismissed her fears as trauma, as guilt. He wondered now if she had tried to warn him. "You can't keep doing this," Harper said. "The truth is already coming out." Moore smiled faintly. "Truth is manageable when guided, chaos is not." Footsteps echoed above them. Harper stiffened. State police, search teams. Someone had finally decided to push past procedure and search the church again. Time was collapsing. "You should leave," Harper said. "Now." Moore shook his head. "I've been leaving for years. Running doesn't erase responsibility." He stepped back into the shadows, toward a narrow passage Harper hadn't noticed before, a crawl space concealed behind shelving. "I trusted you once," Moore said. "Do not prove me wrong." Before Harper could respond, Moore disappeared. Shouts erupted above. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Harper stood alone in the basement, the weight of the paper in his hand heavier than any weapon. He made a choice. When the state police burst in, Harper told them everything, not fragments, not metaphors. Everything. He spoke of the journals, the pits, the disappearances, his own confession. He named names. He dismantled the illusion of Hollow Creek piece by piece, knowing full well that what he was doing would destroy lives, including his own. The fallout was immediate and merciless. Arrests followed, investigations reopened. Families demanded answers no one could give. Hollow Creek became synonymous with betrayal, faith twisted into justification for horror. The church was ordered demolished, its remains hauled away like contaminated soil. Harper resigned. The badge came off easily. The weight of it had been unbearable for years. Shepherd Elijah Moore was never found. Some believed he fled the country. Others insisted he died somewhere in the woods, finally unable to outrun his own doctrine. A few claimed they saw him from time to time, older, quieter, watching from a distance, as if assessing the damage. Harper didn't speculate. He carried his sentence internally, long after the courts had finished with him. Years passed. Hollow Creek emptied slowly. Houses were sold cheap. The school closed. Nature began reclaiming the streets. Silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. On the anniversary of the church's demolition, Harper received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You chose exposure," it read. "I chose containment. History will decide which of us was right." Harper folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with the journals, what remained of them. He had learned that some things should be remembered, even when they hurt, especially when they hurt, because silence, he now understood, was never neutral. It either protected the innocent, or it protected the horror. And Hollow Creek had paid the price for confusing the two. Time did not heal Hollow Creek. It thinned it. Years after the truth surfaced, the town existed only as a name on fading road signs and old maps. What had once been a place of Sunday bells and shared rituals became a quiet stretch of abandoned streets, where nature reclaimed what faith and fear had failed to protect. Vines crept over porches, windows stared out like blind eyes. Silence settled in layers, heavy and permanent. Daniel Harper returned only once a year. He told himself it was obligation, to remember, to confront, to make sure the past did not rewrite itself in his absence. But deep down he knew it was penance. Hollow Creek was where his life had split into before and after, and no amount of distance could seal that fracture completely. The land where the church had stood was now empty. No marker, no memorial. Just an uneven patch of earth where the building had been torn down and hauled away. The soil there refused to grow grass evenly, as if rejecting any attempt at normalcy. Harper stood at the edge of it, hands in his coat pockets, feeling the familiar weight of memory settle into his bones. He was no longer sheriff, no longer anything official, just a man who had survived knowledge he never wanted. The investigations had ended years ago, not because every answer was found, but because there were no more questions anyone dared ask. Some families received partial closure, confirmed deaths, fragments of remains, explanations that felt more like insults than comfort. Others received nothing at all, an absence so complete it erased even the possibility of mourning. Shepherd Elijah Moore remained officially listed as missing. Unofficially, he had become something worse, a symbol. To some, he was a monster hiding behind scripture. To others, a necessary evil who had done what law and morality could not. Online forums debated his actions endlessly, stripping them of context and humanity until they became abstract arguments. No one there smelled the basement. No one read the handwriting closely enough to see the tremor beneath the certainty. Harper had. He alone understood the most dangerous part of Moore's legacy, not the murders, but the logic. Moore had not acted out of rage or pleasure. He had acted out of conviction. And conviction, Harper had learned, was far more contagious. There were people who read the case files and nodded quietly, who never said it out loud, but wondered if the town might have been safer had the secrets stayed buried. Those thoughts frightened Harper more than any ghost story ever could. On his final visit, as he turned to leave the empty lot, something caught his eye. A stone. It hadn't been there before, half buried near the center of the clearing, smooth and dark, as if placed deliberately. Harper approached slowly, a familiar tension tightening in his chest. He knelt and brushed away dirt with his bare hands. Carved into the stone were words, simple and precise. Some truths destroy what they touch. Harper staggered back, breath shallow. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no sign of recent disturbance beyond the stone itself. Whoever had placed it knew exactly where to stand, exactly how deep to dig, and exactly who would find it. That night, Harper did not sleep. Memories resurfaced with renewed clarity. The way Moore spoke, the certainty in his voice, the calm acceptance of his own damnation. Harper had once believed that exposing the truth was the final act, that once everything was dragged into the light, the story would end. He had been wrong. Truth was not an ending, it was an opening. In the weeks that followed, Harper noticed patterns, news articles about whistleblowers who vanished, religious leaders quietly removed from positions without explanation, small-town scandals that dissolved before they could fully surface. In each case, the same language appeared in comment sections and editorials. Some things are better left alone. Exposure helps no one. Silence protects the innocent. Moore's philosophy had not died with him. It had spread. Harper began writing, not memoirs, not confessions, warnings. He documented Hollow Creek in exhaustive detail, not just the events, but the mindset that allowed them to happen, the gradual erosion of accountability, the comfort of delegating moral responsibility to a single trusted figure. The lie that order justified any cost. Publishers rejected the manuscript, too disturbing, too accusatory, too unsettling. One editor wrote back with a single line, "People don't want to believe this could happen anywhere." Harper understood then that belief had never been the problem. Acceptance was. Years later, a package arrived at Harper's door. No return address. Inside was a notebook, leather-bound, familiar. His hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, not Moore's, his own. Pages he did not remember writing filled the notebook. Entries dated months into the future. Thoughts about responsibility, about containment, about names that required consideration. And at the very end was a final entry, written in a hand steadier than the rest. I understand now why he did it. That's how it begins. Harper dropped the notebook as if it were burning. He searched his home, checked locks, checked windows. Nothing was disturbed, no sign of intrusion. Yet the notebook existed, and worse, it was his. Whether it was a threat, a test, or something far more insidious, Harper could not tell. But one truth settled over him with terrifying clarity. Elijah Moore had not been trying to save Hollow Creek alone. He had been trying to create successors. Men who understood the burden of knowing too much. Men capable of choosing silence over justice. Harper burned the notebook that night, watched the pages curl and blacken, the words dissolving into ash. He stayed awake until morning, terrified not of Moore, but of himself. Because the most horrifying legacy was not a vanished shepherd. It was the idea that, under the right circumstances, anyone could be convinced that doing something unforgivable was necessary. As dawn broke, Harper made a vow. He would speak, always, even when no one wanted to listen, even when truth destroyed comfort, because silence was not neutral, it was a choice, and he had already seen where that choice led. Somewhere, far from Hollow Creek, a man watched the world continue its quiet negotiations with truth. Whether Elijah Moore still lived or not no longer mattered. His secret had survived him, and as long as people believed that horror could be justified in the name of order, Hollow Creek would never truly be abandoned. It would simply wait for the next person willing to decide what should